Blazers another chance to tie or take the lead. Gary Trent Jr. three from the corner. Dial it up. Gary Trent Jr.
They're the second best rebounding team percentage-wise in the league, just right behind Utah. Oh, GT, ring it up. 1, 2, 3, and a chance for 4.
Gary Trent Jr. pump fake.
They love the scoring that he provides.
CJ surveying in the paint. Gary Trent Jr. rhythm bounce. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And one. Lillard trying to navigate the defense. Whips a pass to Trent Jr. Pump fake. Step back three.
Their last game.
Embiid's got 19. Gary, step back three. Oh, big shot.
Gary said 3. That's child's play. I made 7.
Gary Trent Jr. 6 points in the first quarter. Step back three. Bang. 10 to shoot for Gary Trent Jr. Steps into a 3. 30th pick in 2016 of the Golden State Warriors. Trent Jr. Blazers a chance to take their first lead. Gary Trent. Blazers would love to put this one away early before they head out 7 games in 7. Anthony Simons stepping back in for CJ Ellaby. Gary Cantor looking for a teammate. Trent Jr. The long.
How many times do you see Gary guard someone who's complaining after so he's on one right now. He's on
for Kuzma. Gary in transition. Pull up 3. Oh, cash money. Broom ball.
That's who you want to take that shot at the end. Another good job from the Blazers, double teaming, and Gary in typical.
Gary Trent Jr. Nobody checking him as double team on Dame. Gary Trent Jr. from outside. Blazers bring it back down. Gary Trent Jr. Oh, the hezzy with the right off the glass, Lamar.
We had this conversation last year. He's not just a spot up guy.
Gary Trent Jr. loses Drummond and shows it to him, Lamar.
Oh, man, he played pity pat. Job.
Here with 3 minutes and some change left in the first half. Trent Jr. shaking Looney.
And Zach Collins, you want to listen to that video.
Zach Collins, one of the 4 Blazers unable to go tonight due to... So Knicks back up 9. Gary Trent Jr. putting on Blazers. Got to get it up. Gary Trent Jr. scoop.
And Cotton was able to elevate like that.
Trent Jr. starts to this season. Blazers quick hands. Those two a huge reason for their team's success. And Gary Trent,
in addition to shooting 41% from the three-point line, he's athletic on the break. Bazemore, an open 3.
Bazemore hits the corner 3. Gary. CJ, thoughts of challenging Gobert? Bounce pass to Gary Trent Jr. with. Nice find, Gary. Good win. And acquisitions not able to go tonight.
Good pass from Harris. Got him involved. So the more they can involve him, Jordan, in some of this action, he can serve to provide confusion to the...
Showing why he's having his best season so far.
The entire NBA is trying to figure out how to slow Joel Embiid down. He's the 4th leading scorer in the league, 29 points.
Carmelo Anthony, but Gary Trent...
Part of that team, and CJ knew that was his opportunity to prove it on the side. Let me go get it. Derek will be able to do that.
6 to shoot. Gary Trent Jr.
It's not a basketball play. It's unnecessary.
Trent Jr. for positioning. Korkmaz defends. Melo into the paint. Back outside. Good look for Gary Trent Jr. Blazers unable to get the 3, but Cantor gives them another chance. Gary Trent Jr. Clean look from Dame. Struggling from the 3-point line. Just 2 of 9. Gary Trent Jr. Hood for 3. Lillard, offensive rebound. Trent Jr. will tee it up with their largest lead. Simons in the open court. Trent Jr. spot up. More frequently from outside. Rodney Hood races it down against his former team. Gary Trent Jr. Bang, bang. Try the triple off the handoff. Cantor, offensive rebound. Kicks out to Trent Jr. Osman back into the game, tries to check Dame, and Gary Trent Jr.
to the rim. Doesn't miss too many of those. Good job from the Blazers to not give up.
Dame. Wizards try to send 2. Nice find to Gary Trent. Dame let the clock wind down. Goes to his left to avoid the double team. Simons trying to handle the pass. Trent Jr. before the horn. Huge 3. by Trent Jr. to close out the third quarter.
It's back to Mississippi on him with that.
Get a few more ticks on the clock. That win against the Timberwolves last night. Lakers cruised all night long. Gary Trent Jr. from the corner. Covington. Nice connection to Gary Trent. Looking for some potential backup. Dame gets to the paint. Gary Trent Jr. in the corner.
Got a bunch of stars on the floor.
Gary Trent Jr. fires in another one.
And that's one of them.
Gary Trent Jr.
He's a bit short.
Gary Trent Jr. pull up with the Sixers under a minute left. Gary Trent Jr. trying to pop three. Foul line jump. They're sitting on 20 points. Gary Trent Jr. into the paint. Play continues. Gary Trent Jr. goes to his left. Step back to shoot for Portland. Trent Jr. high arcing.
Wow.
Matthews able to recover. 5 seconds to go for Gary Trent Jr.
Welcome home, Rocco.
Trent Jr. down the lane. Can't get the tough finish. Rips away the rebound. And
As they clear it out. Boy.
That's tough what Ennis did because he started vertical and then put his hands down. A lot of times guys get whistled for a foul, but Ennis got all basketball to help force the miss.
Gary Trent Jr. a second foul that he's able to draw this time. Allen misses the three. Gary Trent Jr. tries to bring it down himself, able to regain.
Gary has 22 points, and it doesn't even really feel like a big deal. And I say
Dixon. Lillard quickly traps, slips it to Trent Jr. Attacks Alexander Walker. Dame splits the defenders, chases his own dribble. Gary Trent Jr. trying to be an operative.
Of course, stepping you. With Giannis, it ends in a dunk.
Goal in the Sixers offense, can't get the bank shot. Gary Trent Jr. up ahead, pump fake. Trent Jr. with the steal, open runway, liftoff. Gary Trent Jr.
He's everywhere. Gary is just being alert.
Cantor on the floor defending Porzingis, and more defense for the Blazers.
Not all over the place. He never stopped his pursuit as he was guarded.
Copy paste. Nurk trying to apply some pressure. Gary Trent Jr. picks it and fit. Trent Jr. the steal. Edwards in pursuit.
And one.
And another three.
Sees that skip and DJ ready to step into it.
Covington gets on the floor. Trent Jr. trying to race ahead. Here comes Hart attacking Covington. Covington rips it away. Trent Jr. trying to go by Ingram. Window.
Went on over to the Houston Rockets. That's my first connection to Portland.
Gary gets into the paint, finds Cantor. Nice feed.
For the Jazz. Their core group is all back. They already know how they want to play on both ends of the floor. The Blazers are the ones figuring it out.
Trent Jr. with a beautiful feed.
Turning the corner. He's got Clarkson on his back, so Gobert knows he has to step over and help. Position. Beating Ennis down the floor. Being the first person off the ground. Good answer on the other end.
Trying to keep the momentum going on their longest road trip of the season. Training camp was cut short. You don't have as many preseason games. Gary Trent Jr. to Cantor. Cantor has been delightful.
Denver, a quick burst here with a couple of threes, up 6.
That's with the left hand in the finish. Melo will try the trick. Dame up ahead to Jones Jr. Blazers will slow it down. Covington wide open from Gary Trent. The lid on it! Dame behind the back, loses Fox. Has a chance, splits the lane. Gary Trent Jr. CJ before the whole next.
He went to the backcourt and then set the screen. Once Dame came across the line, got downhill.